Okay, so the original invite for all of you, for those that are involved in the show, it's about graphite, and graphite is a medium that I've been using for quite a long time now. So it was quite an interesting sort of thing, like when Belinda did come to my studio, it was laying out work that I'd been doing and I've been really comfortable with and have been honing for over a period of time, and very much like Armando, like testing surface, working with materials, pushing the boundary of the medium and actually sort of slowing down the process. I must say, with experience over time of working, that trust in the engagement that the artist has with the work and just allowing time to sort of sit back. I don't know whether that's something an abstractionist would do. And try and sort of grow with the work. And so I do vary the work that I do where they can be really large works, where I like that sort of intensity of being embellished by work, and even as a viewer of going and connecting with other artists' work, that's sort of being drawn into work and connecting in a different way. As an arts educator and a manager and artist, like there's always been that interplay of working with others and observing and just being fascinated by what can come out of just a session of looking into a medium and how you can explore and push that medium. So over time, there's always been links to certain areas that I've worked from. I've spent a lot of time on the South Coast and also in Central Australia in various parts. So that there is that connection to and passion and love of the land, which intrinsically sits in some sort of way. And I was like in terms of you talking about that concept of art and activism, whether that actually belongs in my work or in Graziella's work, I don't know. But I know that there is a connection and an influence to the way we live our lives and the way that we work as artists, and those influences that come into your work. And for me, it's always been that connection to the land and appreciation of the past and the history. So when it comes to creating work, I mean, people would look at a lot of my work and they may see elements of the land, but really it can be any interpretation, and that's kind of the thing for myself, where certain places do resonate. So with regards to working with graphite, I mean, I do work with other mediums, but it's always been something that I've come back to over time and I don't know whether I will ever be finished with pushing the medium and seeing how it unfolds. So for this show, as Belinda came to the studio, I'd already started looking at projects or forms of study that I wanted to do where I connect and collaborate or interact with other creatives. And I've done that more for my own, I guess, development or disconnection from what is art, you know, why are we doing all these things? And I guess through art education, which I'm very passionate about, do you go into further study? And I've had lots of talk about higher ed and sort of looking at postgraduate and going down that path. But I looked at other ways of engaging and growing as an artist and through other artists. And so the journey with Graziella and I started before this show was initiated, and as Belinda came into the studio, I was able to show her work that I'd started doing on silk and just experimenting with vinyl, all different types of materials, and looking at the behaviour of mediums. So sometimes not necessarily graphite, but in this day it was. So she was open to that experimentation with Graziella and I, and Graziella was open to doing something together for this show. But we had no idea what the result would become. Originally we were looking at quite a big piece, which we do still have. But in terms of the connection with other artists and the space, there was all sort of thinking about those elements and also what was actually happening between us both. I generally work on surfaces, like I have worked on a lot of porous surfaces, but with the graphite I prefer working on surfaces where the graphite watercolour can sit on top and it can move, it can granulate, and you could just watch it unfold. This process completely threw the way that I worked, and you had all these sort of emotional sort of roller coasters that you're subjected to in looking at something and not fully understanding. And even now when I look at the work, I have an admiration for it. I see Graziella's, identity, and I see elements of my identity, and that's a really quite bizarre feeling, as an artist, when you're used to connecting and looking at your work in this setting as well as in the studio. So for us both, the whole process of dropping things off, picking things up, but not necessarily telling each other what to do, was probably the most liberated I've ever felt in preparing the work for a show.
Do you want to maybe just talk a little about the different roles, like the outcomes on the object from both of you?
Yeah. So the fabric itself I sourced, because that was the whole environmental aspect, which is something we've been looking at, and it's all a big project plan, is sourcing material that was discarded, so that's sort of getting hold of a material that I have no idea what it can be used from. There are also the challenges of the weight of the material. It's not a standard sort of woven material, so Graziella was not used to working with a fabric that keeps changing and it keeps moving. Even when I first started the work, where I sort of laid out like 4 meters of fabric that I had, and I was bleaching using the sun to bleach, so before I even started painting, because I work with graphite watercolour, I knock things back, I hose things down, I relay, and I work with brushes, so all different types of fat and small brushes. Generally, like you were saying, the work is usually quite detailed that I do, and in this case you couldn't do that. So, and it was also, I was really aware of Graziella's work, so in the beginning I started pulling apart other material, and then I realised I can't work that way. So I just painted, and then I sort of knocked back, had quite a few pieces of works and different materials, but this one we kept coming back to. And then dropped that off, then Graziella came over and we sort of looked at this and other fabrics. And then she took them away, and then I think really quickly this worked as she started draping and started unravelling and pulling, and she was quite nervous about that sort of interrupting the painting and pulling the painting apart, and whether the graphite, because it's not fixed, it's still not fixed, it can still wear, and I think that connection to what we're trying to explore with an environmental sense is that fading of time, things disappearing. So there's all these ideas that are coming out of this that we are going to keep pursuing down the track. But the weaving, and so after Graziella, she wove and she stitched and she did it sort of just hung, and a lot of the interaction between us two was through social media. It's just Instagram, taking photos. It was just that. We didn't really spend a lot of time in each other's studios.
So the form that we're seeing, anyone else can jump in as well, the form that we're seeing there, is that a result of parts of planes being stitched together?
No, I think that's more with the draping, where the way that the work's hung on either side and up the top. It's really heavy and it does tend to sort of sculpt in a way, but also when she starts unravelling and pulling apart and threading parts of the fabric, that also plays, a part of the actual structure. Even with, there were so many stages that we went through and where we were filming, and where she would, one of the first pieces I saw of this was where you could look within the work. So as an abstractionist, there was some really exciting things happening that has given us so much more to keep pushing, whatever this is that we're doing. And but also, I guess in the end, there is that sort of, we do think about, the environment and all of those things that are happening, but really it comes back to the work and what is happening to the work for us, and the challenges, and just the lack of control, but the influence. So working on different fabrics, the influence that this work is having in its total sort of outcome. Like we have control, but we don't have control. And so the fall, the work itself is part of that. So that sort of sense of trust in each other. I've never had anyone pull apart my work, or probably Graciela, her work is the same. It's a very minimal approach to the way she finishes off her work. So the idea of how artists are influenced is something that I've been really interested in for a long time, and was my initial approach to Graciela, wanting to work with her and work with other artists on future projects that this will get building from. So this opportunity it's been really good in, I guess, bearing all and just being able to just work with what it is. And I'm still really kind of not sure how I like the work, but it makes me, I don't know how I feel about the work. And I feel like, as like graphite, I'm not done with it. I need to keep exploring where these things can take. And that's the beauty of being an artist, isn't it? Really. That sort of passion for wanting to keep working and pushing the work.
I'm a very process-driven artist. It seems to kind of drive everything for me. But in the case of this series of works, as much as the process was driving it in terms of the experimentation with materials, and eventually landing on graphite in terms of a material and a pigment, and something that almost connects photography and textiles, which are two major techniques that I use within my practice. It actually initially this series came from a series of photographic negatives that I sourced from eBay. And they're stereoscopic negatives from 1910s, 1920s. And they were pretty much, a lot of them were landscapes. I was quite lucky that early on I managed to source 4 that were all from the same location, which happened to be a valley in France, as it were. But what I really loved about these glass slides were that they were images, but they were also objects. They had a materiality to them because of the passage of time, and the fact that when you scanned these images, that you had slight scratches, that there were slight marks on the actual negatives that showed usage. The other thing that I really enjoyed about them was that these aren't negatives that are used nowadays. You know, the technology to actually use them nowadays is pretty much gone. So they exist within this kind of almost registration of a landscape which, you know, 100 years on, we don't know whether it still exists or exists in that way anymore. So they're a record of past, they've got time embedded with them, and they also exist as both image and object in itself, which is something which I think with my work, I really try and achieve, is that whatever I work on, is that it exists, when somebody looks at it, they have this engagement whereby they're questioning, is this supposed to be a visual work or is this supposed to be a sculptural work, and it sits in that in-between space. When I was doing the research for this body of work, one of the things that informed that approach was the Japanese theory of Ma, which acknowledges the beauty and the aesthetic potential for things that are in between. And so, for example, it's used a lot within Eastern culture, within architecture, so acknowledging the space between walls, between doors, windows, and that they have just as much importance as the main event, as it were, as well. And so you can apply that to how alcoves sit within rooms as well, and how there's spaces between works. So for me, when I was developing the work, I was working on almost two strands. One was the original photograph, which I scanned and enlarged. So this section of the work itself, if I were to go back to the original negative, it's probably about, that size. It's teeny tiny. So this actually brings up, like I was mentioning, it brings up the marks, that little almost curl that you see there. That's almost like a scratch or a mark on the surface of the original negative. And what I was trying to do is almost materialize this kind of element of the actual work, and also kind of take this and visualize the actual material concept itself, the material section itself, so they come together and they coalesce. So this went through a process of what I termed at the time materialization, where it's covered with different types of mixed media, and trying to bring it back to almost a glass-like sensation. And again, it's got graphite on it to capitalize on the graphite's kind of reflective qualities as well.
So, Armando, can I just ask a question? So, what's the relationship between the original image and this image? Are you projecting it and drawing it? Are you drawing it by looking at it?
This is actually the scan, and
That's
it's
a scan.
really enlarged and then digitally printed,
Right.
and then worked on top of with graphite and mixed medias as well. And then this one, this panel, is actually, I come from a textiles background, so I wanted to continue that. And when I started my master's at the National Art School, my proposition in order to get in was how I saw embroidery as a form of drawing, and I wanted to push that further. And I work collaboratively with some embroidery artisans in Delhi, and I had done for a number of years, and I wanted to push that more through the masters. So what I did here is that I took the photograph that connected through to this one, and I sent that to them with quite detailed instructions. It's still quite loose in a way, talking about this idea about drawing with thread, and the translation of the photographic to the material. And this is what they sent back, or the embroidery is what they sent back. And then I worked on top of that with pigment stains, and in this case, graphite pigment stains. So it's this layering and kind of pushing of what that original image actually was, and going from a print of a photograph that was taken in 1920s by some random adventuring photographer, to then being scanned and printed out, then embroidered by someone in Delhi, and then worked on top of it by somebody who originally came from the UK of Spanish and Irish descent in Australia, kind of thing. So when we talk about landscape, in a way, the way I source the negatives is trying to find places that I don't recognize, or that places which are not recognizable to specific people. So I never really use images that, oh yes, that's that place in Rome or Paris or wherever it may be. So there's never anything architectural within the negatives. There's never any people as well, so there's no kind of human element within it. So for me, yes, the origin is landscape, but it becomes more and more abstracted as more hands are involved in that process. And I remember somebody asking me, oh, you don't have any you don't use imagery where there's people in it. And I think for me personally, I don't want that, because I feel like when somebody's viewing a work, if there's a figure within that work, you automatically connect to the human. Whereas I want somebody to look at the work, potentially see a landscape, not necessarily a specific one, and in that way they can tap into their own memories or collective memories of place. And the idea that actually the human is actively embedded in the work because my hands have gone into creating it. A whole series of hands have gone into creating it with the embroiderers in India. And so actually you are looking at a piece of human work. The hand is actively embedded in it. So there's a relationship between hand and landscape and materiality within the actual work. So yeah, I don't know.
Is embroidery in India, is it hand stitched, or do you know how they build it up?
Yes, because I was very new to the process. So when I started this whole process, obviously I'm not there. So there's a lot of conversation over WhatsApp and exchanges of like photographs and stuff. And they actually sent me a video, and it's actually using the long needle. And I was quite specific with, also I was sending the linen over with obviously the imagery. I was quite specific in terms of asking them if they could possibly source linen that was as close to the linen that I was using as possible. And that was so that, well, A, they would stain in the same way, but also that it would sink into the surface of the actual fabric as well, rather than stand out. Which is something I'm kind of experimenting more with now by actually using different yarns, so it actually comes out more as well.
You've been doing this for quite a while now, probably.
Yeah.
10 years?
About that.
Yeah. The same relationships.
Same relationships, and I've been over and I've met with them. Never spent any time there, but actually just a few weeks ago organised to go over later in the year for 3 weeks to spend some time with them, so I'm looking forward to that. And try and push the boundaries of that relationship in a way, because I think with what I do is very different to what they would normally do. And it's very specific. Like, I wanted to acknowledge the embroiderers when I completed the work at the National Art School. And I remember, they sent me the names and I had to say, is this a joke? And the guys were like, absolutely not, because it's a group of 7 guys and they're all called Mohammed and they're all from a certain area and village area. So I found it really fascinating that this technique and this process of making was all executed by men and from a specific place as well. So that's another thing which I'm really looking forward to kind of engaging with when I'm there. And how to push the work further. But I remember one phone call conversation I was having with the guy I go through, and actually it was really lovely because I was kind of like, I asked him, can you ask him what he thinks of the work or what he thinks of the process? And he actually said, oh, I like it and it feels like drawing but with thread. And to me I was like, that's what it's all about, right, kind of thing. So I was really happy with that reaction. So I thought, okay, there really is that understanding of the intention and where it goes. And I've made sure that whenever the work is complete, I send them photographs so that they can see the work as well.
So far as my relationship with graphite, I've kind of always used it. It's very accessible, it's something you always had. I was that kid in the back of the class in school that was drawing things in the margins of books instead of actually doing the work. Or I would finish the work early and do it on the back sort of thing. So maybe it stemmed off from that, but I do love graphite. I love the texture of it. So I went through a phase with charcoal, but come back to graphite. It's just something about it. As for the brushes technique, that's something that, well, most of the techniques that I use and the tools that I use, I've learned by watching other artists that do a similar style. So there's several that I follow on the internet that do a similar figurative thing with graphite, and I learned about the tooling things from them, from watching videos of them doing their work and that sort of thing. And the brushes was one of those. I don't remember which artist I saw using them first, but I do know that several do it. And I thought that that looked like an interesting thing to try, and that's sort of usually how it works. I'll see an artist doing something, I'm like, oh, that looks interesting, I'll try it. And it's the same thing, that's what happened with the emulsion lifts. I saw someone doing it and I thought that looks interesting, I'll try it. And so I started with just regular paint brushes, but they're designed for paint, which is a liquid, so it wasn't particularly successful. And then one day I thought to try using makeup brushes instead. So I went to Kmart and bought some cheap makeup brushes because they're designed for foundation and eyeshadow and that sort of thing. So they're designed for powder pigments. And so they've got a denser, like more bristles in the brush, and they're shorter. And so they hold the powder pigment better than paintbrushes do. And so I got some of those and haven't looked back.
No.
Yeah.
So these drawings that we're looking at here, the hands, it's not all done on brushes.
No.
No. It's
So
all about that softening effect.
Yeah, so there's a lot of back and forth, push and pull. You sort of start with the brushes and build up the sort of tonal areas where the dark parts are, the light parts are, and then go into it with pencils and about 4 different types of eraser. And then once I've started that process, it's a lot of back and forth from the pencil and the erasers back into the brushes again and then back to the erasers. And then ultimately finishing off with the brushes as well, that just softens it all nicely, which I think when you're doing figurative work like this, it can be very easy to make it too sharp and then it becomes ineffective, or at least a little bit surreal, a little bit unreal. And so that softening at the end just makes it a little bit more lifelike, I think.
And
Because we're not all hard lines.
what about your sort of fascination with hands? Is that it? Because they are one of the most difficult things to draw.
Yeah.
Was that because it was a challenge, or?
It might have started out that way. It might have been initially pushing myself to get better at my craft and doing the thing that everyone says is the most challenging. It definitely might have started that way, but it's not ultimately why I do it now. I just feel really connected to hands for various reasons. Obviously, to varying degrees, and with a touch of salt, we all have hands, so we all have this immediate connection. In similar vein to what you were saying, with there being, if there's a figure in your work, you have an immediate connection to that. Same thing with hands, it doesn't have to be a full figure. I have done full figures before, and I will continue to do them, I'm sure, but it doesn't have to be a full figure to still get that instant connection with the work that is going to be at least somewhat unique to each person. Everyone here will look at that and feel a different thing. They might feel slightly similar, but they're all going to be unique to each person, and I really love that. I think that's really important. Also, I do predominantly use my own hands as the references, which is a thing in itself, but then on top of that, with that, everyone gets a slightly different response, everyone's hands are slightly different. There's that, there's layers. Yeah.
I'm curious about your relationship to skin. Because to me that, when I look at those, I'm not an artist at all, and what comes through with that is this incredible sensitivity to touch, and it's a particular kind of skin. You know, I wonder if you've thought of that as the bigger subject than just hands or heads or bodies or...
Definitely. It's, it was something that I wrote about when I was doing my honours thesis. Skin definitely was something, and I spoke about it in relation to the paper as well, because a lot of people, with young people anyway, they talk about the skin as being something smooth, and particularly with, you know, beauty expectations and that sort of thing. Like there's this whole thing of smoothing the skin, anti-wrinkle cream, all of these things to get smooth plastic skin, which is just not true. And I use hot press paper, which people describe as smooth paper as opposed to hot press, which is textured. But it's not smooth either. It's got its own texture to it. It's really subtle. It's like skin, and it holds the graphite like graphite holds in your skin. Like when I'm drawing, I get graphite in my fingers, and it feels the same as the way that it sits on and in the paper. So I wrote about that a lot with my.
When you look at skin, did you come? There's an American artist who's known, he's well known, he's known. He made a whole series of paintings of skin, but diseased skin, with bites and sores, and the most beautiful paintings. They were coloured. They were just, I can't think, it's someone that's well known, and I'm thinking back to when I first saw him probably 20 years ago. But it was that, you know, at first you thought they were just these beautiful paintings, and then you realise that they were actually diseased skins. And I think that's what I mean by skin being a bigger area. It's in a sense, it's that space between the inner body and the outer body that can break down and wound, and you know, has that tenderness about it too.
Yeah. I think that's the thing that resonated for me when I sort of opening out, I just sat and worked, and I was looking, and it did sort of move right into the shifts and the changes in the skin, more so than the composition or the shapes. It's just that sort of element in the drawing that really kind of exhibited that.
I think that's its strength when you get up close.
Yeah,
that's what
it's
we
just
all
like
there.
it kept getting more, you know,
Yeah.
like you moved into it, it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, this is actually really amazing work. What do you mean by the emotion and that sort of process?
Okay, so there's no emulsion in this, just to clarify for anyone who's not sure. That's a completely separate thing. So the emulsion is a photography process. So it's film photography, like instant film photography, and you remove the emulsion, which is this really thin layer that's got the actual image on it and all of the pigment and stuff, from the negative on the instant film when it comes out of the film camera. And so it's this really fragile, like tissue paper that's in water with an image on it. And so it's got this transparency to it, and it's really hard to work with because it's so fragile, so you can tear it really easily. And it's got that similar skin-like texture when you're working with it in the water. And so you remove it from the negative, and then you can fix it onto a surface, whether that's paper or something else.
Look 20 minutes, it's journey. Look 20 minutes.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah.
I know the painting.
Yeah. As soon as you said the name, I was like,
Yeah. Sorry about that.
no, that's fine.
Can I ask, I'm curious, there's maybe a few questions in here, you can pick which one you want to answer, about the significance of certain aspects within the drawing. So for instance, they're both left hands, both making fists, particular gestures. So is there a significance to those choices?
It's interesting that you point out that they're left hands, because that wasn't a deliberate decision, but I am left-handed, so maybe it was an unconscious decision when I was taking the reference photos. It probably was just a natural thing to sort of use this hand, because that's the one I use all the time. So that's interesting that you pointed that out. And with the fists, that's quite unique for me so far. I haven't really done anything that's got that really tangible tension in it before. A lot of my work has been a lot more like gentle gestures. So this is a little bit of a segue, but also still the same thing. And it was very much, I was thinking about, with this one that's sort of facing down, was sort of tensions that you internalize or keep to yourself, that sort of thing, like not necessarily expressing that. And then this one that's rising up is more about flipping it on its head, no more about holding those tensions inside, sharing them, expressing whatever feelings they might be instead of bottling them up. Sort of.
I mean, it's a well-known gesture of fire.
Yes, exactly. That's where I was about to go next. So yeah. Yeah, so you said that for me. Yeah.
So
And then of course you've got there's with the composition, there's an element of a circle happening. So it becomes a circular thing. It's not, once you've gone from this stage to this stage, you're not necessarily going to stay there. You can circle back around and circle back around.
Yeah, that kind of answers another question I had about the choice of the two images side by side. They complement each other. There's a sort of duality of this, I guess, internalized sensation versus the more outward expression of
Yes.
emotion.
Exactly.
That reminds me of the tinsel dance, you know, with that beautiful circle of arms.